subsequently some kind of secondary explosion that brought down the upper floors, but the initial hit point on the ground floor is only about 10 feet high and 16 or 17 feet wide. There are unbroken windows around it. There's unbroken fence, a couple of cars. What you don't find is a massive pile of debris from a 100-ton airliner, principally made out of aluminum. You don't find the wings. You don't find seats or luggage or bodies. You don't even find the tail, which would have snapped off if the government's official account were correct, so that you just don't find what you're looking for there. In fact, the engines were never recovered, those engines being virtually indestructible. So what we do find is this complete absence of debris, but then stuff starts to show up. And it's quite evident that it was planted. And this particular example is a very nice illustration. It was even moved around and photographed from more than one location, as though they could thereby multiply the amount of evidence they had that a Boeing 757 had actually hit the building. But the point I was coming to, too, is this. So the fires were put out relatively early, but later you have these billowing black clouds coming up from the Pentagon. And if you study the photographs, it turns out they're coming from a series of enormous dumpsters. In other words, the billowing black smoke, which would be visible to all the members of Congress who are rushed out of the Capitol on the ground that maybe the Capitol was the next target, they would look across the Potomac and see all this billowing dark black smoke. But in fact, it's coming from dumpsters. It's a special effect. I had a fellow come through Duluth when I was still living there about 2 years ago now, and he had 44 additional frames that showed the dumpsters, the smoke coming from the dumpsters, and it was from a different angle than the frames I had available to me. And you could actually see daylight in between the dumpsters and the building, and it was obvious it was coming from the dumpsters, not from the building. So what I'm telling you is this government has been conning us, playing us for saps, and using, of course, this whole fabricated event as a justification for these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are in violation of international law, the UN Charter, even the U.S. Constitution, and, of course, for passing the Patriot Act, which takes away some of our most fundamental rights under the Constitution, putting the whole country under surveillance. And anyone who thinks they were actually doing a surveillance on terrorists doesn't understand. This was for domestic political purposes. They've been putting the whole country under surveillance. And then, of course, going about, and I think even blackmailing members of the Congress to induce them to support this liability immunity act for the huge telecommunication giant, so that they'll never be published for violating the law on behalf of an administration that is completely out of control.
Hello, and we're back on The Real News. We're going to go to our phone calls now. Our Statesville number is 704-873-1400. Our Davie County number is 336-499-0681. We'd like to hear from you. Again, our website's therealnewsradio.com, and you can email us at onair@therealnewsradio.com. And once again, I would like to inform you that when we go off the air at 12, Davie County War Eagles football will come on at noon on 1520. So stay tuned and listen to that. And I wanted to address something this week. Many people seem to ask, what is it that I want to happen, or what do I expect our government to be or to do? And I would like to say a few things here. One, I believe in freedom, real freedom. The reason regular folks, the poor, and the downtrodden came here in the first place. And I believe in our Constitution and abiding by it fully without waiver. In a land with real freedom, we would not have a cradle-to-grave oppressive taxation system that you have to pay a CPA just to calculate for you, while you are ripped and extorted out of 60% of what you earn. In a land with real freedom, we would not tolerate license and permits and inspections for everything we try to do, especially with respect to making improvements to privately owned property such as $480 well permits. In a land with real freedom, we would never submit to property tax that ultimately means that a person never owns their own property, and it can be taken away from you by the government if you do not pay their yearly fee of blackmail by means of extortion. Yes, before someone calls and says, I know we must have services, police, schools, etc., and possibly other taxes would have to be raised to offset the difference, but the people, we the people, would not be at the mercy of the government with regards to our personal property. In a truly free society, people would have to be responsible for themselves. This notion of taking money from the working and giving it to the sorry waste of the world that refuse to work would have to stop also. the working and giving, not the handicapped, not truly needy, but the moochers that have been on the teat of the giant government sow entitlement program for way too long. And most importantly, in a free society, we would be free from government intrusion, enjoying the rights of privacy. We would embrace freedom and never surrender our liberty one bit for security, always holding the government to a firm standard of accountability and standing together with a well-armed citizenry to never accept the corruption of that which we now stand shamefully and willfully accepting. If you'd like to call in, our phone number is 704-873-1400, Davie County 336-490681. And I want to report on something that's being reported this week by the John Birch Society. A procedure called donation after cardiac death is being allowed and encouraged by the federal government, organ banks, and medical doctors as a way to increase organ donations. This protocol, used now more commonly for infant heart transplants, is frighteningly immoral and sets to redefine death declarations. This method, technically known as transplanting after declaration of cardiocirculatory death, allows doctors to declare death following the stoppage of the heart rather than the more certain brain death criteria. Then, as quickly as 75 seconds to 5 minutes after the declaration, doctors can slice into the baby's chest to harvest the heart. The new method of death declaration has been brought to light because of a report in New England Journal of Medicine that highlighted 3 cases of DCD studied at children's hospitals in Denver. 3 babies on life support who showed little brain function but who did not meet the criteria for brain death were taken off ventilators, and their hearts were harvested and transplanted into other infants. While the public likely understands when death occurs, it's the medical establishment that is clearly redefining the term death to suit their own agenda, removing the moral certitude in death declarations as defined by the laws of God and under civil law opens the door to egregious ethical abuses that we are just beginning to see. I wanted to report on this news from John Birch Society that you will hear very little about in the mainstream press, and I think that God-fearing Christian people might find very disturbing. This past week, Warren Buffett, the billionaire co-founder of top private equity firm and a prominent voice for U.S. fiscal responsibility, called on the United States and its elected officials to combat the nation's fast-growing multi-trillion-dollar debt load. Buffett, Blackstone Group LP co-founder Peter Peterson, and former comptroller David Walker were part of a panel that spoke Thursday night in Omaha, Nebraska, following the national premiere of the documentary IOUSA. The talk was a simulcast in more than 350 movie theaters. The film argues the country might face economic disaster if it can't find a way to pay some $53 trillion it has committed to spend and does not have now, as the population ages and Medicare and Social Security costs soar. It also argues, and panelists agreed, that the United States has become so dependent on foreign investors to buy its goods and its publicly issued debt. There was also an agreement that many politicians fear making tough policy choices that have the ramifications far beyond the current election cycle. Our politics have become so embedded and so partisan with so many special interests that they require a massive effort from the public telling them, "We want something done," Peterson said. Former Comptroller General was our guest some months back, and we made it very clear that our government was broke. His exact words was that the till is empty and that hard changes have to be implemented now to prevent this runaway debt continuing and destroying our children's future. And I know Brian